Hello and welcome again to another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are focused on right in or about April 30th, maybe a little bit of 1st of May, that would be in 418, when we are talking about a guy who is a theologian and who also has some good early on arm wrestling, let's just call that internal to church doctrine about a host of different things: sin, grace, free will, what that actually looks at. And we're talking about Pelagius, but who we actually are visiting with today is Dr. Andrew Chronister, who I'm going to make sure I get the title right on this, Dr. Chronister, the Associate Professor of Patristics and Ancient Languages at Kendrick Glennon Seminary in St. Louis. So, did I get close enough on that?
You got it perfect.
Right
Thanks.
on it. Very fine to be able to do that. That's great. So we don't want anybody to tune out because they think you're about to show us what Sanskrit's all about or something like that. So just hang tough, right, to do that. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us kind of the time frame and tell us about who these main characters are, if you will, in this story that we're talking about. This a pretty important conversation and dialogue, right? About what is the role of man and what do you have and what can you do and what can you not do. So let me
All
be
right.
quiet and let you talk.
Yeah, in terms of the time frame, we're looking at the fourth and early fifth century um, in Italy, North Africa, the Holy Land, sort of all of these different places come into play at various points in the course of the controversy that we call the Pelagian controversy, which of course is named after Pelagius. So Pelagius was originally from Britain, we think.
Hmm.
He ended up in Rome sometime, maybe right at the end of the fourth century, very beginning of the fifth century. And we don't know much about his background, but we know that he started to develop a following around himself. He was a sort of a strong preacher of asceticism. So this notion of doing different works and acts to sort of build up the virtues and sort of seek after holiness and these sorts of things. And so he's part of a broader ascetic movement within the fourth century. Of course, the fourth century sees a lot of changes for Christianity, right? Because at the beginning of the fourth century, we have the great persecution under Diocletian, and then all of a sudden, Edict of Milan, we have the legalization of Christianity. And so
Hmm.
Christians' role and position within the Roman Empire suddenly changes. Maybe not quite overnight, but very close to overnight. All of a sudden, it's sort of Christians are increasingly privileged throughout the empire, and so for some, it seems that sort of privilege that they have within the Roman Empire um, might might breed a certain sort of lukewarmness towards the faith. People, if
Mm.
if you don't have a danger of being killed for your faith, you might not take it as seriously, or there might be other reasons why you would become Christian rather than simply because you really believe in Jesus Christ. And so you start to see throughout the fourth century various figures come to the fore as sort of saying, hey, we need to take our faith seriously. We need to live a robust Christian life, um, live out the full demands of the gospel. So you have people like Saint Anthony of the desert, in the desert of Egypt, going out there and
Hmm.
living in the wilderness by himself. And then later on, you have people like Jerome, Saint Jerome, and his
Hmm.
former one-time friend Rufinus of Aquileia, and then you also have Pelagius. So there's a lot of different ascetic figures here running around doing this sort of like it's not quite monasticism, at least not for all of them, in the sense that they don't all have like individual monasteries. Jerome and Rufinus do, of course, and Anthony, of course, is doing sort of a hermit type thing.
Hmm.
Um, Pelagius was not part of a monastery per se, but he was sort of preaching to the Christians of Rome. And it seems like he has some sort of following around himself, especially among the upper class in Rome, the
Okay.
aristocrats. So,
But just for clarity here, though, he's
yeah,
not a priest,
he's
right?
not a priest.
Right.
No, he's just a layman.
Right. Okay.
And yeah, so sometimes he's called a monk. scholars will debate how appropriate that term is because he wasn't part of a monastery.
Okay.
So people go back and forth on that, but that's sort of a helpful descriptor for him. So yeah, so he is developing this following around himself, and it seems like what's really motivating him is he wants people to take the gospel seriously, and he says, "Man, we've been given so many gifts. We have the gift of the scriptures, we have the gift of the example of Jesus Christ, um, and if we're not living out the gospel the way that we're supposed to be doing, really, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And we just need to, put into action the stuff that we know to be true. God has told us how he wants us to live our lives. And so we just need to, get down to get down to doing it. And so he has this desire to present to the people that he's preaching to, hey, it's possible to avoid sin. It's possible to avoid sin. And so we just need to get out there and get to work on doing it. So this sounds like good stuff, right?
Right, right.
But so yeah, it sounds like good stuff. And initially, he's got a lot of positive acclaim around him. But people are also start sort of pointing out some issues with his program. And of course, the most famous of these sort of people that are pointing out problems with his program is
Hmm.
Saint Augustine of Hippo, right? So he's a bishop in the port city of Hippo Regius, which is in modern day Algeria. Um, and he gets word about Pelagius. Pelagius at this point is still up in Rome. And he hears a lot of good stuff about Pelagius, but he also hears that Pelagius has been not taking the grace of God as seriously as he should. He's
Okay.
been opposing the grace of God. And so basically, it's sort of a long story, and I won't bore you all with all the details. But Pelagius ends up coming through North Africa and then travels over into the Holy Land. And in the course of this, a controversy erupts between Augustine and Pelagius and his sort of student or disciple or associate. Scholars will debate on how exactly to frame this, but a man named Celestius or Caelestius or Caelestius, depending on what pronunciation of Latin you're going with.
And this is Pelagius's associate student.
Right.
Right, right. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So Pelagius and Celestius. And so this whole controversy erupts. And at the heart of it is this question of God's grace, but also, sort of backing up a little bit, the question of the human condition, and more specifically, whether humanity has a fallen condition. Um, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they eat that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and bad stuff happens, right?
Right.
The question is, what are those bad things that happen? Are Adam and Eve just presenting a bad example for all of us? Or has their sin in some way damaged human nature or sort of changed the human condition in some way from what it originally was? And so someone like Pelagius, for example, would say they've set a bad example for us, and we shouldn't sort of discount that. But there's nothing that sin of Adam has done. It hasn't done anything to human nature as such. It hasn't made it harder for us to avoid sin, these sorts of things. Whereas for Augustine, on the other side, he says, well, no.
Mm, right.
Adam's sin has damaged human nature. It's made us more inclined to sin. It's sort of alienated us from God. Um, it's introduced death into the world, right? Uh, and so it's a lot harder for us to avoid sin than it was for Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. And so, especially in this situation where we have such a wound, we need the healing of grace in order to help us to choose the good, to avoid sin, to love God and neighbor, and these sorts of things.
Wow.
So that's a basic synopsis.
Well, but now are Augustine and Pelagius, are they squaring off against each other in the same way like Arius or Athanasius would, or there would have been others where there was, there was a showdown, right? I mean, or whether these conversations were actually taking place, or was it more just in writings,
Yeah.
and how did all that kind of bubble up?
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question. So Pelagius and Augustine never had the opportunity to chat in person.
Okay.
Augustine tells us that he saw Pelagius from a distance, saw his face once or twice when they were both in Carthage, which is sort of the major city in North Africa near Hippo, where Augustine was the bishop. Um, but they never have the opportunity to actually sit down and chat with one another, which I think is really unfortunate. Because maybe things would have gone differently, and the thing would have been resolved more amicably if they had had the chance to talk. But such is life. So the way that the controversy kind of plays out is Augustine gets access to some of Pelagius's writings, and he'll write against Pelagius what Pelagius had written.
Hmm.
Pelagius's associate Celestius that I mentioned previously, he also never interacted directly with Augustine, it seems, at least as far as we know, but he was a little bit more of a lightning rod. When he was in Carthage. So Pelagius kind of passed through Hippo and passed through Carthage without really drawing a whole lot of attention to himself. Celestius was a little bit different because when he came down through Carthage, he actually tried to get ordained a priest in Carthage.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
and as a part of that, so they didn't have seminaries back in the day. But Celestius wasn't a local guy, and so the normal practice at that point was to at least get some, you wanted to get some feedback from other people that were aware of this guy to make sure he wasn't crazy.
Sure.
And so there was actually a deacon from Italy who was present in Carthage, and he submitted some problematic statements that Celestius was accused of teaching. A lot of them have to do with sort of a denial of original sin. Um, and so Celestius at that point was brought before a panel of bishops. Augustine was not among them. But this panel of bishops basically condemned Celestius for teaching these propositions. And so that's sort of the situation that actually gets Augustine to start writing against the Pelagians. There's a sort of Roman official in town in Carthage who asks Augustine if he would write some stuff about these positions that Celestius had been circulating. Um, so all of this is taking place right around 411 or 412. And that takes us, you know, we have sort of this initial sort of flare up of activity around 411, 412, and then everything kind of quiets down in large part because Pelagius is no longer present in Carthage. He's gone over
Mm.
to the Holy Land. Celestius seems like he ended up in Ephesus, in modern day Turkey. Um, and so it's a few years before Augustine starts to get word of sort of continuing Pelagian activity elsewhere. Things kind of come to a head a little bit more in 415, because at that point Pelagius has been in the Holy Land for a few years. He gets himself in trouble to some extent with some Western Christians who are also living in the Holy Land, people like Jerome, and some others who are not fans of Pelagius. And so Pelagius is actually brought before a synod of bishops in December of 415. And people like Jerome and others are trying to get Pelagius condemned. Well, as it turns out, these Eastern bishops, basically none of the Western Christians show up for the synod, and so they have this sort
Mm.
of document in Latin, that are listing these sort of positions that Pelagius is accused of teaching. There's nobody there to explain to the bishops what exactly these propositions mean or what might be problematic about them. So, long story short, Pelagius is acquitted of heresy at this synod. Um, and
Wow.
yeah,
That, that,
so
we're We're
Yeah.
enjoying our conversation so much here with Dr. Chronister to talk about this really, you know, the development. I would, these are my words, right? But the development of uh, personalities as well as doctrine and theology and how those things logistically all kind of come together instead of us having like some big debate, right? For everybody to let's all get together and decide whether this is right or wrong. This thing is taking an interesting path as we're talking about Pelagius. So thank you. We're just doing a quick check-in. All right. So let's get back to the Synod. Okay.
Yeah, so Pelagius is acquitted of heresy, and word of this gets back to Augustine in Hippo the following spring,
Mm,
and this is a big, you know, a really huge disaster in Augustine's mind. And I think it's such a big disaster in large part because we rewind a little bit and go back to 411. One of the
okay.
arguments that the Pelagians were making in Carthage was that Eastern Christians agreed with their views. Say, okay, we got all these Christians in the East, talking about Greece and Egypt and Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, the Holy Land. All of those Christians, the Pelagians are saying, agree with our views. And so if you have a problem with our views, you have a problem with the whole Eastern Church. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
And, people like Augustine are not buying that. But then fast forward to 415, you have a synod of Eastern bishops basically saying, now, Pelagius, you're all right. What you teach is fine. There's no
Sure.
problems here. So all of a sudden it seems like, oh, well, maybe what they were saying was right back in 411. And so at this point, Augustine realizes he needs to not just sort of respond to individual writings or sort of try to address this through back channels and more directly with Pelagius, because he had actually sent a messenger to Pelagius the previous year to try to like offer some sort of correction for his views. But he decides, okay, things have gotten big enough now. We need to break out the big guns, as it were. So the African bishops get together. They host a few councils in the spring, summer of 416. They send letters up to Pope Innocent in Rome and ask him to get involved and basically to sort of back up the condemnations that they
Mm.
themselves have issued against Pelagius and Celestius. Uh,
So they're not really looking, if I could jump in,
yeah,
they're not really looking for somebody to be judge and jury to decide who's right, who's wrong. Are they really kind of looking to say, hey, by the way, we all agree, right? Pope, that
yeah,
this is really kind of where everything is. And can we go ahead and to use a different analogy of maybe a little Barney Fifeism there, right? Can we just nip this in the bud right now, right? Can we
right.
just go ahead, get this out of the way? We're dealing with it out here. We don't want to let heresy get, and I'm way stretching this out, but I'm just saying we don't want to let heresy get too far ahead. And so, can you please comment on this or issue
Right.
a bull or something to be able to make sure that we just kind of stop the story right now.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So yeah, they want the sort of the strong arm of Pope Innocent to sort of
Hmm.
step in and just settle the issue. And Innocent will. So actually, the in January of 417, he replies back to them and says, "Hey, I got your stuff, got your letters." Um, uh, Says, "Thanks for submitting all of this to me for my judgment." And I agree, this is problematic stuff that Pelagius and Celestius are teaching, so they're excommunicated until they change their ways and change their views. Okay. So there's much rejoicing in Africa. It seems like things okay, everything's settled, we're all good to go. But then Pope Innocent dies in March of 417. His successor, Pope Zosimus, um, is unresponsive to early African letters that are sent to basically say, hey, congratulations on your election as Pope. just want to make sure that we're going to keep the same sort of, angle of approach with Pelagius and
Right.
Celestius that, our good friend Pope Innocent had done earlier
Have you
this
read the
year.
memos? Did you read the minutes from the last meeting? Right.
Right, right.
Right.
Pope Zosimus does not respond to them. Okay,
Mm.
so it seems like they send these letters to him in the, in the spring, late spring of 417, and summer's going by and they haven't heard anything, um and you can almost tell that Augustine's getting a little nervous, because in September of 417 he delivers this sermon, and it's sort of he has this famous line in it which is often misquoted a little bit. Roma locuta est, causa finita est. So Rome has spoken, the case is closed. It's not exactly what he says, but says something along those lines. Look, we've still got some Pelagians running around here, but Rome has spoken on the issue, so it's let's hope that this is over with.
Right. Who's sitting in the throne of Peter is not really the issue here. The issue is the Pope's already decided, story's
Right,
over. Right.
right,
Okay.
yeah. So maybe Augustine's preaching that out of sort of a hopeful spirit rather than like sort of like, yeah, this is definitely the case, because a few weeks later, a messenger arrives in North Africa from Pope Zosimus, and he basically says, "Hey, I've been reviewing the cases of Pelagius and Celestius, and I don't think Pelagius is a heretic at all, and I don't think Celestius is a heretic either." But I recognize that you guys down in Africa had actually examined Celestius in person back in 411. And so while I am comfortable overturning the excommunication of Pelagius, because that was basically something that Pope Innocent had done,
Hmm.
and it hadn't really originated with with an African council. He realizes that he says basically with Celestius, I'd like to do the same thing with Celestius. So if you have any issues with that, just get back to me within, I can't remember how many days he says, like 40 days or 45 days or something like that. Um, and so the Africans get this and are like, oh no, this is a disaster. Pope Zosimus is sort of he's flip-flopping on what Innocent had said, and so they mobilize really quickly. They get together a bunch of documentation, and they held. It seems like they hold some little small council,
Mm.
maybe just of like the heavy hitters among the African bishops. Augustine, Aurelius, who's the bishop of Carthage, and a few other of the big names at that time. And they send this documentation up to Rome, and it's sort of radio silence for a while over the winter. Now, uh, the Mediterranean in winter is not something you want to go across, and so it kind of makes sense that there's not a lot of communication there. But um, we next hear from Pope Zosimus in March of 418, and scholars will debate and disagree about how exactly to interpret this letter that he sends. But it seems to me that Zosimus sends this letter, and he basically says, I'm the Pope. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Um, I can tell you guys are upset at me and you feel like I didn't really examine this case very carefully. But I'm the Pope and nobody's going to tell me what to do. And I think the subtext there is, man, I'm realizing I've made a mess of things and I need to sort of like find a graceful way to backtrack here a little bit, because people are unhappy. Well, what ends up happening is the Africans have also sent a delegation to the emperor up in Ravenna, in sort of northeast Italy.
Hmm.
And so what ends up happening is April 30th, we get a condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius issued by the emperor. May 1st, we have a council held in Carthage of all the African bishops who issue a condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius. And then later that summer, Pope Zosimus does an about face and condemns Pelagius and Celestius as well. And so that's sort of the end of the line for Pelagius. We really don't
Mm.
hear much about him after that. And it's a little bit unclear what happens to him or where he
Mm,
goes.
okay.
Now, there is a sort of like, there are others that come to the fore at this point. So Julian of Eclanum, an Italian bishop, and I think 18 other Italian bishops, they refuse to sign on to the condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius. And so they're sent into exile. Um, and it's really Julian. So to get back, that's a very long-winded answer to the question you asked me probably an hour ago. But
And that's why we do what we do. No, no, no. That's about this is not 3 minutes in church history. This is a whole part of what happened this week, right? So
okay, so I can spend a whole week telling
you
this
can go
story.
the whole week.
Okay,
That's exactly
good,
right.
good. Well, I think originally your question was what was the sort of interaction between Pelagius and Augustine? And the answer is really there's not a whole lot.
Mm,
Augustine's sort of writing against some of Pelagius's writings. He's writing against their views in general, and they're sort of like in some ways they're communicating, maybe not with one another directly, but probably reading each other's writings or getting wind of what the responses are. That all sort of changes though with Julian. So it's Julian of Eclanum is the one that him and Augustine are really going head to head in a way that Augustine and Pelagius and Celestius never had. So
okay.
Julian is going after Augustine for, being this sort of provincial African, this African down there is trying to tell us what to believe and what not to
Mm,
believe, and he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Um, and he's accusing Augustine of being a Manichae, right? Which, if we've read Augustine's Confessions, we know he was a Manichae.
hmm
So Manichaeism, sort of a dualistic religion, has some overlap with Christianity, but basically believing there's a good God and there's an evil God, and they're just sort of at war. The body's bad, matter's bad, spirit's good. So the sort of classic dualism. Julian says, yeah, you used to be a Manichae and you still are. You're sort of a crypto Manichae now because you're teaching stuff like this original sin stuff, which seems to imply that the body's bad, that there's something evil within the body. And so Augustine is sort of feeling, feeling attacked by Julian.
Sure.
Um, But I don't think it's just that. I think it's in addition to all of those sort of like, the personal attacks he's receiving from Julian, it's also the fact that Julian is a bishop and he's got 18 other bishops along with him who are refusing to agree to the condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius. Augustine is very familiar in North Africa with groups of bishops refusing to get along with the church more broadly, right? So in Augustine's Africa, we have this sort of schism of the Donatists versus the Catholics that's been
hmm
ongoing for 100 years. Um, and so it seems to me that part of Augustine's sort of sense that he really needs to take down Julian is the fact that Julian's a bishop and he's got these other bishops with him and they're threatening, maybe not explicitly, but threatening a schism, right? Threatening to sort of uh, provide some sort of long-lasting home for opponents or for supporters of Pelagius's views. And so this is really animating not entirely, but to a large extent, Augustine's sort of anti-Pelagian activity after 418 until his death in 430. So we just get this back and forth between Augustine and Julian in that time period with increasingly longer works, up to the point where Augustine's last work against Julian is incomplete, but thank goodness it was incomplete because it already is, if you
Mm.
get it's up there on my shelf, but it's like one of the thickest books on my shelf. Um, and it's not even complete. So you just imagine all the extra paper we would have to have if he had finished that work. So
Wow. So I mean, so how does that fit in to where Augustine is and the whole idea that, we would pull from that, let's just call it predestination versus free will kind of conversation about part of that. Has Augustine fully fleshed that out and developed that by this period of time that he's come to that conclusion that that is indeed, and this Pelagius is coming in here and talking about things where free will is or not. I mean, so we got the grace question, we got the sin question, we've got some of this other, but has that all been developed as well? Is that kind of the fight that's happening with these Italian bishops
Right.
and him as well? Is that in the
Yeah,
mix?
it's certainly in the mix there. Yeah. So it's debated among scholars how exactly to trace Augustine's development on the issues of free will and grace and predestination. Some people want to argue for a lot more continuity in Augustine's thinking over the course of his time. He becomes a Christian in 387. Um, when do we start seeing his sort of mature positions on grace and free will present? Uh, so I don't have a firm position on that myself because it's not something
Sure.
I've dug into too much yet. But yeah, different scholars will have different views. It does seem to me that it's there fairly early on. So by
Okay.
the late 390s, we see in some of his writings thoughts on grace and free will and the interaction of those two things. That's very similar to what we'll see at the end of the 420s and his sort of final writings. But oddly, there's sort of like this intervening period, especially at the beginning of the Pelagian controversy, where he's not quite as hard line on things. He seems to have a more of a balance between grace and free will. Always emphasizing the priority of grace, that God is always the one that gets the ball rolling in terms of our own growth and holiness. But nevertheless allowing for, I don't know, at least in my view, a sort of real contribution and a real response on the human
Mm,
part, and the possibility of rejecting God's gifts of grace. Now, by the end of his life, we have at least one place where Augustine seems to say very clearly that there's some type of grace that you can't resist, right? So he has this notion of irresistible grace, it seems to me, by the end of his life. But whether it seems to me there's some story of development there, and when exactly it takes place and
mm.
how it takes place is debated. Now, predestination is a part of all that, right? Predestination being sort of God's plan to bring some people to eternal life, right? And Augustine will reject the idea that it's based on foreknowledge. So lots of different figures are talking about
Sure.
predestination, but what we mean by it is sometimes very different. So some authors will say, well, it's yes, God predestines certain people for eternal life, but it's based on his foreknowledge of how they'll respond to his gifts of grace or what they'll do in the course of their lives. Whereas for Augustine, it seems more so that predestination is based on God's own choice to, save people out of
Right.
the massa damnata, this sort of condemned mass, right? So all of humanity, thanks to Adam, exists in a state that is deserving of eternal damnation, and God, in His mercy, uh, rescues some people from that big, hunk of humanity.
But we
So
wouldn't really define this as a kind of a precursor to Armenians and Calvinists, for example. This is not like a yes, you are, no, I'm not. We're on the other side. Let's debate this thing out and be able to. It's more of yeah, this guy is not really lining up in the way that things ought to be, and here's kind of why, and it's maybe it's kind of a precursor to some of this, is it kind of moves towards some of that, but it wasn't like it was a square off, right?
right, right, yeah. So I would say certainly sort of with the benefit of an additional 1,500 years of history, we look back
Right.
at that and we say, Augustine really seems like a Calvinist here.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Right. Right.
um and of course it's more historically accurate to say, well, yeah, there's some passages in which Calvin was very much influenced by certain parts of Augustine's writings.
Right.
And seems to me that there's Augustine's views were not sort of accepted in their totality, even in his lifetime or in the centuries following him. There was just these sort of recurring debates over how exactly to conceive of the interaction of grace and free will and predestination and God's universal salvific will. How do we put all of these different pieces together that really respects human freedom, but also divine sovereignty and
Hmm.
the certitude of divine providence? These are really difficult things, and um, Augustine's not providing an answer that's convincing to everyone. I mean, whoever can provide an answer that's convincing to everyone on any topic, but especially a topic like this, right?
We hadn't met that person yet, have we?
Yeah, yeah. Um, and so it seems to me that the recurring debates that we see in church history on these issues just points out that there's something that we're still just sort of like not it's just not lining up quite right.
Mm.
And so you see that come up again, like in the ninth century. I'm going way beyond my area of expertise
No,
here.
no, no. Well, that's fine.
Ninth century, there's some predestination debates, um, and then there's talk of this. Aquinas gets into this a bit as well. And then of course, yeah, the Reformation period, and then even within Catholicism, after the Reformation, you have these debates between sort of Molinists and Bonyesians, and trying to conceive of the way to sort of tell this story of God's providence and grace and free will in a way that that makes sense with all the things that we want to hold in tension. It's really difficult stuff.
Right, right, right. But that's why good folks come to seminaries to learn those things, right? So they can spend time and ponder and write and
Right.
chew on those type of things. But you've written about some of this as well, right? So tell us about your book.
Yeah. So my book, it's I'd say it's more historical than theological. It's doctors over the world are saying that it's a good cure for insomnia as well. So if anyone's out there struggling with insomnia, this is a miracle cure. Just read one page and go right to sleep. Um, Basically, my book, what I'm trying to do is to just explore a um, a particular aspect of the Pelagian controversy that I don't think has been emphasized quite as much, and it was something that I alluded to earlier,
Hmm.
that Augustine's motivations for getting involved in the controversy are not simply his theological opposition to Pelagius and Celestius and Julian. I don't want to discount the importance of that. Obviously, that's a big, important part of why he's writing all these things.
Hmm.
But I want to add into the mix this notion that he's concerned about the unity of the church, um, and that it's his desire to prevent schism, to stave off disunity in various forms, that prompts his involvement in the controversy, basically from the beginning up until the end. So I kind of talked about that a little bit with Julian and the threat that he sees in Julian for for a sort of long-lasting schism. Because at least in the ancient world, it's hard to have a long-lasting schism if you don't have bishops on your side. But we also see this concern for unity at the very beginning, right? So we
Hmm.
see these Pelagians in Carthage, as I mentioned this as well, making these arguments that Eastern Christians agree with them, and you Western Christians are just, you're not really disagreeing with us, you're disagreeing with the East. And so there's sort of like this undercurrent of doctrinal division, ecclesial division, that Augustine is just, he's not happy to hear that. And he's especially not happy to hear that in 411, because in 411, they're having this big meeting in Carthage to bring about the unity of the Donatists with the Catholics again.
Hmm.
And so it was like, been going on for 100 years, this schism, and it finally seems like it's coming to an end. And then all of a sudden we've got these Pelagians running around saying, well, you're out of unity with what's going on in the East. And so it's like, this is the last thing that you want to hear when you're trying to bring about unity within Africa, right? So anyway, my book is just trying to trace the ways in which that concern for unity is showing
Yeah.
up at various points throughout the controversy.
Yeah. Because I mean, it's that we were talking about earlier, right? These are humans, these are people, they have personalities, they have time frames, they have things that are going on. Uh, uh, Jesus didn't give the apostles a three-ring notebook and say, "This is
Right.
here it all is." Okay,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it's a lot easier when we could say, "Jesus, what do we do about this?" And
Yeah.
story's over, right? I mean,
Uh-huh.
but lo, these 350 years later, we're still trying to kind of figure all this thing out,
Yep.
and that's part of what is the story of the church, right? And is
Hmm.
the story that is Christian history is how we get to these decisions and how we kind of decide what is doctrine, what is not doctrine, what is true, what is not, and it's rarely a clean cut story of anything that I've seen yet. It's
Right.
usually a path, right? And
Yep.
it may be a long path
Hmm.
before we actually kind of get there for that too. So, well, great. Well, we want to make sure everybody is aware of the book, and we're going to certainly put that into all of our all of our socials and things that if you are listening to this at this time of the recording, then you're probably watching us on YouTube. So go down and look in our description because that's where we'll put a link to the book to where people can learn more about this really important time frame and the episode and the conversation that is around that doctrine and theology as well. So, Dr. Andrew Chronister, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic. So hopefully folks will continue to follow us on all our socials as well to learn more about Christian history today of something that happens every day in Christian history. Be sure to check out our Christian history chronicles as well, which are just ongoing dialogue and conversation on particular subjects throughout Christian history that you'll be able to find and learn more about. Hopefully, you're signed up on our newsletter so that you can keep up with the things that we are doing and upcoming episodes and upcoming activity that we're doing within the Center for Christian History. Thanks for joining.